Humans have this tendency to want to be connected. At the same time, we began to see, and now we're still seeing, and perhaps even worse, is that there are forces, or there's a major force that try to divide people, to be divisive.
If AI goes in a direction where only the smart people succeed with their brain, what happens to the people who are good with their hands, but the robots replace them? I mean, how can we address that issue?
A lot of people are theorizing, the impact of AI and so on. In reality, when push comes to shove, people will gravitate back to more human behavior.
Hello, I'm Thomas W. Palkin II, host of the Tea with Thomas podcast series, where I chat with ordinary folks who lead extraordinary lives. Every single one of us has an amazing life story, and today I'm so pleased to be joined by Mr. Edward Xie, founder of Gaofeng Advisory, a China-rooted strategic consultancy that started in 2014. He's not only a leading expert on business strategy, but he has just authored a new book, China in a New World. Thank you, Dr. Xie, for coming to our studio in Beijing and to have Tea with Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas. It's very nice to see you again.
Yes, it's always wonderful to see you again. And so let's get started. And you've recently written a book, China in the New World. And I see a quote here: why global companies must put China at the core of their global plans. Have global companies not put China at the core before? And if not, why have they not put it at the core, and why are they changing right now to put a bigger emphasis on China?
Yeah, I think for a long time, global companies look at China as a market or a place to do manufacturing, and then they can export the products from China to the rest of the world. I think that continues to be the case for many companies. But also many companies have come to China, tried the China market, and were actually not that successful. So many of them have either downsized the operations in China, or they have withdrawn from China. So for a lot of companies, China is no longer just a necessary place to be in. For a lot it is, but a lot also not the case. But I think we're now entering into a very different world now. The world becoming more complicated, have much more changes, and as we know. But also importantly is that the presence of China is now being felt increasingly across many other parts of the world. Not only because China is an exporter of products only, which China continues to be the case, but China also is now exporting knowledge, innovation, business model, and also capital. And so to a lot of companies, even if they don't have operations in China, they need to consider China as part of the global strategy, because China would come to their doors either as a competitor or potentially as a collaborator.
Okay.
So that is the changes that we're now seeing, actually.
Okay. Now, as you mentioned, and you also talk a little bit about it in your book, is that some companies have come to China and were not so successful. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why did some companies just fail and other ones became very successful?
I think for a lot of foreign companies, when they first came to China, they would assume China is just like any other market that they've been in. They may have been in some other Asian countries or Latin American countries, or if they're American headquartered, they may have been to Europe and maybe some to Middle East and Africa and so on, right? And so they assume that China is just like any other market. They just bring whatever they've been doing in the rest of the world to China, and then assume that will work. For many companies, that strategy actually worked because many of the products or brands are pretty good, and the Chinese customers or the consumers will pick those products up and embrace those brands. But in many other situations, there's a lot of need to adapt to the China situation that actually many of these foreign companies did not expect, or they didn't actually know that would be so much different.
So why is China different than, say, Europe or other markets? What makes China this so different and so special?
Well, I'm talking about when China was just opening up, let's say in the early 1990s, or even 2000s and so on. And so every period of China actually is quite different. And why is China different, right? So in the early stages, especially in the early 90s and in the 2000s, China was simply quickly developing. But China came from a very different background than most other countries. China, first of all, is a socialist country, so it has a remnants of the planned economy. So there's a lot of SOEs or state-owned enterprises here. So the government played a very important role in driving the development of the country, in particular the economy. And also many of the industries are being regulated somehow through the Chinese way of seeing how industries should be regulated and then over time be unregulated or deregulated. So that process of deregulation is very unfamiliar, or has been very unfamiliar to a lot of Western companies. They didn't really understand or anticipate how to deal with this kind of regulations that they were not familiar with.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, you also mentioned in your book, socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
And so this also, often when I speak to Americans or Westerners, they get very confused by it. Okay. So then they ask me for a definition. To be honest, I don't know how to define it. How would you define it?
Yeah, I think it's another term that each company used as well, as you know, Thomas, is socialist market economy.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So to a lot of people, it sounds quite an oxymoron.
Yeah.
So how could you have market economy on one hand, and then you have socialism on the other hand? But actually, China has proven that has been working over the last several decades, is the combination of how to think about the society, the economy, from the socialist standpoint. What is a socialist? Actually, that you actually put the collective interest ahead of the individual interest, or at least at par with the individual interest, right? Putting the common good at a very high level. That's socialism.
Sure.
Whereas market economy principles is that, you conduct your business or whatever you do according to market, let's say supply and demand. Right?
Yes.
So you don't just plan and at the beginning of a year and say, this year we're going to produce this so much and we never change. You have to change actually according to the market situation evolved, right? Mm-hmm. So the market economy principles and the socialism principles working together is a characteristic of how China has been experimenting its own ways of reforming, opening up over the last several decades.
It seems like there's trying to create some type of balance between, say, some government control and some free market. But obviously, there's going to be times when there's a conflict between that balance. What has China done that's been successful to create this balance? But what are other moments when these imbalances created problems?
Let's talk about problems first, right?
Okay.
So, we have seen over the years that, with the Chinese government's decision on focusing on certain areas and therefore, allocating resources to certain areas, and sometimes it leads to a lot of companies taking advantages of the funding from the government, and many of them are very genuine sort of. But there's also you also could run into situation where people simply take the money and didn't really
disappear
or didn't do it in the proper way. So this kind of situation do happen. But at the same time, I think if we look at how China has been developing over the last several decades, and how not only measured by the GDP, but I think more importantly, is measured by other aspects of the development, such as technological innovation, how technology has been evolving so quickly now, and frankly also from other dimensions, even like the military, or from the standpoint of space technology, and also environmental control or improvement. That kind of stuff, it requires coordination from the state or from the government, working with businesses, to really working in hand in some degree of synchronization to provide the results that we're now seeing today.
I see what you mean, because actually now that what you're saying earlier kind of has a light in my head that I've never thought about before, and I appreciate that, which is, for example, China will focus on a certain industry and then another industry not focus that much on it, so there creates an imbalance. And so about a decade ago, the big thing in China was infrastructure building and property development. Look what happened. So Let's address that issue of property development. Now there's really serious struggles with the real estate market in China. What do you believe China is going to do to resolve this major problem?
Mm-hmm. The property development has been overly done. I think we all know that. It's also an intention by the Chinese government to really pop the bubble.
Sure.
Because I think the Chinese government actually have recognized that the continuation of over-reliance on property development as a way to drum up the economy will not be sustainable. In fact, even worse, it will lead to a lot of probably not the most positive ultimate impact for the Chinese society and the Chinese economy. So I think they have proactively tried to prop that bubble. And now we're now in that process of reconciliating that, that situation. From what I understand, what the Chinese government is trying to do is to make housing more affordable for the Chinese people, and therefore increasingly we're going to probably see more, government subsidized housing, providing housing at a more reasonable cost to the Chinese citizens, and downplay the important roles, the roles of the private developers.
That's very interesting. But as you know, and you're a strategist and I'm a strategist, so you have to look at the pros and cons. Obviously, and I remember I lived in South Korea, and there was a time the government actually tried to pop the property budget, and they couldn't, simply because most families had 80% of their savings into that house or other houses. So had the prices dropped, their savings would have disappeared. Is this going to be a similar scenario in China because so many Chinese families have put their money into property? And how can that be resolved?
It's already happening.
Yeah.
It's already happening. But China's sort of property bubble happened so fast. Is that for a lot of families, actually, when they bought the housing, when the housing prices were still relatively cheap. And then over time, the pricing went up. And so you believe that you actually have, the house, it's worth so much money. Sure. But in reality, it's virtual money because you haven't materialized.
Same as the stock market.
Right?
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff. So
paper money.
But certainly, I mean, we shouldn't sort of downplay the impact of, the burst of the bubble. Okay. But nonetheless, it's probably not as bad as many people in the West are talking about.
Okay, but what about issues like Evergrande and some of these property developers? They put in a lot of money and it just disappeared. And you had people who actually bought houses, and maybe these development buildings have not been finished and completed. What's going to happen there?
What do you think is going to happen? I think every local governments have to find solutions to try to address this. But I think one should have enough confidence that with the capability of the states, of the governments, that ultimately there will be solutions to address this kind of issues. Which, in my view, is not probably not the most important aspects of what we're talking about today.
Sure.
We're just actually looking forward to the impact of China for the rest of the world.
Okay, definitely. And also, one of China's impact is science and technology development. And you are an expert on science and technology. So, Ed Shay, I guess with the science and the technology development, it's going very fast in China. But do you think it's possible it's going too fast with the development?
What is too fast?
Too fast would be, for example, the automation. Many people are losing their jobs, getting replaced by robots, or issues of, for example, AI, brains, basically controlling how people think. Okay. Let's go ahead and address that issue. And it's a major issue in China. And to be honest, when I first speak to Chinese about technology, they're very proud of their technology. But then when I tell them about the warnings, I get the sense they haven't thought about these concerns before. But you have. So how can we address its development along with the problems and challenges that come with it?
Yeah, Thomas, as you know, AI is a big deal.
Sure.
But we have seen over the history of humanity that every time when there's something new and revolutionary came about, that will cause certain degree of dislocation in the society, in how humans live their lives. Right?
Yeah.
It's happened over the years, and started with paper, printed paper,
Sure.
or the compass, firepower, or the first industrial revolution, invention of electricity, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So every time you have this kind of major dislocations, society by definition will have to adjust. I think AI is no different, and maybe it's even bigger than any other previous era of change. But nonetheless, I think we're seeing both sides of what's happening. On one hand, you're right, it could impact on the employment of certain kind of people, and maybe the impact could be very significant. But at the same time, we're also seeing that technology, in particular AI, is now providing huge opportunities for young people in particular to really grab the opportunity to start their own business.
So let's talk about the opportunities.
And become, and could become really, successful.
Okay.
I think actually China is probably is a leading place in the world that provide that range of opportunities for young people.
Okay. So like if you're, because obviously you talk to young people all the time, and we have viewers here, so many of them may be young viewers. So what if you want them to if they're involved in AI, what recommendations do you have for them? What do you want to tell the young people about how to take advantage of the opportunities? And the reason I mention this is because I've spoken to some people, and they said that once they develop the AI programs, sometimes they ended up losing the job because they developed their own replacement. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. The two parts of AI.
Yeah.
Right? One is the so-called hardcore AI technology.
Okay.
Or in particular, when people talk about so-called language models, I think today the U.S. and China are going neck to neck on that kind of development. But those kind of development usually takes a lot of money and capital, and also utilize a lot of resources, in particular electricity and other forms of energy. And so right now we're seeing that the companies who are really doing at the lead of this kind of these areas are usually big companies, right? Like Google or Elon Musk company, and in China people like ByteDance and Alibaba and so on. That's one type of AI.
Oh, okay.
The other type of AI is what generally called the AI plus, meaning apply AI into specific situations, in particular business applications. And that China is really providing the most range of possibilities among all the countries in the world, because China, is the leading country in, let's say, in manufacturing. In a lot of areas, China, it's just the size of the industries is overwhelming. And within each of the industries, you can have numerous potential scenarios where you can use AI to develop new ideas. It's not only about streamlining, operations and taking out people. It's not that only.
Okay. Yeah.
It is actually to use AI to explore the future of how this industries is going to evolve, and also beyond industries. As an example, I think, we today, humanity probably only understand about 1% of the cosmos. 1%, maybe even more.
Okay. Maybe even less, though.
Maybe that's what I mean. Yeah, I say 1%.
Could be even less than 1%. Yeah.
Less than 1%.
Yeah.
The cosmos is so huge and so mysterious.
Yeah.
But we're part of the cosmos.
Yes.
And one would hope that with AI or other type of technology, we can improve our understanding of who the cosmos is, or what it is, and who we are as humanity. And through that, actually, I'm pretty confident that there will be new business ideas and opportunities that will be created through this kind of discovery. And technology can enable that, which is not possible before. And so if you have this interest and the capabilities and the curiosity, today is actually probably the best time in humanities.
Now, what's also, I've noticed, like, say, for example, in the Chinese culture, there's a strong emphasis on education and learning. So, for example, they focus more on the white collar jobs and in that area. But then there's just regular people who like to be action. They need to work with their hands. They need to move around. They need to travel. So how will, if AI goes in a direction where only the smart people succeed with their brain, what happens to the people who are good with their hands, but the robots replace them? I mean, how can we address that issue?
I think, in fact, people good with their hands are still going to be very important.
Oh, okay.
I don't think robots can replace
Oh,
everything.
okay.
As an example, I think let's say you want to travel, you go on you're going to airport, you're going to airlines. Of course, robots can replace a lot of the human activities, but at the same time, there's a lot of I think as a passenger, you would expect that you will be greeted by some humans.
It's
that,
true.
The service, at least for me, and I'm sure it's a lot for a lot of people, you don't want everything to be served by a robot.
You still need a
especially on
human.
flight.
You need human interaction.
In fact, I think, today a lot of people are theorizing, the impact of AI and so on. In reality, when push comes to shove, people will gravitate back to more human behavior.
Very interesting. And you see China also going in that direction, right?
Of course.
Good. Yeah. Okay, so let's say, and going back to the book, let's say, for example, there was a time you talked about the 3 C's, the companies, competitors, and customers. And then you wanted to emphasize conditions. So
context.
Context. I had it down as conditions. I apologize. But context. Can you sort of explain what you meant by that then?
But I already talked about when you asked the question.
China's conditions.
China is actually quite different.
Okay,
than
sure.
Almost any other market that a lot of multinational company has been in. China certainly has a very different culture and civilization.
Okay.
But also very different conditions. The conditions manifest in the
like the
socialism with Chinese characteristics. The existence of a large number of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and then the prevalence of the government in many things that are happening in China. But at the same time, there's also many privately owned companies who are very extremely entrepreneurial and extremely fast. That combination of a myriad of different components to an economy, and therefore by implication, the competitive nature of many of the sectors in China is actually providing a lot of surprises to companies who are not used to understanding this context. Because in many cases, let's say, if you're headquartered in America, you will assume that any other market is kind of like in America, meaning, you have, market economy, capitalism, and so I just go in and assume that's the case. But when they came to China, they find actually China is very different. So the context is very important. I think the context also manifests itself in the history of China, in the culture of China and the civilization of China, which are very, very fundamentally different than those.
Can you go ahead and explain a little bit about that cultural understanding? Because, like, for example, you'll have certain so-called Western experts on China, and they just don't get it. And I mean, I'm an outsider too, but I mean, I still have a little bit of a deeper understanding than some of these experts. But it seems like, for example, do you believe it's because they don't really understand Chinese civilization, its 5,000-year history? When you're talking to these so-called China experts from the West, and you get this impression they don't really understand China, what do you think is the reason behind it? And how do you explain how China's 5,000-year civilization really impacts all Chinese people?
The Chinese culture and civilization is actually very diversified. Most people didn't get it. Most people didn't really know what Chinese culture and civilization is. For those who thought they knew, they would equate China with, let's say, Confucianism. And Confucianism to them is hierarchical and so on. But of course, Confucianism is a major line of thought or school of thought in China. But there are many other schools of thought of China, like legalism, Taoism, Maoism, and also the Chinese are probably the first kind of people to codify the military thinking, strategy thinking.
Sun Tzu?
I think I should say Sun Tzu, right?
Sun Tzu.
But Sun Tzu is only one of them. But
really?
Many there are other people as well. Probably Chinese was one of the first people to create a multidimensional way of thinking about military strategy. And Chinese also very early on already developed logical thinking so it's a mind read of different kinds of thoughts. And today, if you examine a Chinese mind, actually, you actually see different thoughts still happening within the Chinese mind.
Interesting.
Yeah, that most people really don't get it.
That's true.
And then the Chinese actually are also very embracive. Since the Han Dynasty, which is close to 2,000 years ago, we have inherited Buddhism from India or through Western Asia into China, and then we synthesized or localized Buddhism and integrated that into our school of thought. So today, you look at the Chinese mind, it works both. There's a whole school of thinking that's very indigenous, but also school of thinking that's coming from outside. In this case, in Buddhism's case, it came from India, and then not too long ago, we inherited Marxism, which came from Europe, and then also, of course, we embraced the market economy principles since about 30, 40 years ago. So it's an encompassing set of culture and civilization, which I think I will summarize this as highly diversified, inclusive. It includes a lot of different things, but also adaptive. That the culture and civilization adapts over time. And so against this backdrop, if you look at how the People's Republic of China, since its formation in 1949, that's how they've been operating, is that they have made different type of experiments. They try to learn and adapt along the way. Some of the experiments are not that successful, and in fact quite disastrous. Yeah. But at the same time, since we formally opened up since about 40 years ago, in general the batting average has been pretty high, and we're now seeing what we're now seeing because the backdrop of this ability to be diversified, to be willing to embrace new ideas and to learn and adapt, that actually the core to the Chinese civilization and culture that I think a lot of people didn't really quite get it. And so when people talk about China, they usually talk about China at a superficial level, like China's market is big, China has a lot of people, China has a lot of STEM students, Chinese leaders are engineers, not lawyers, and so on. Right?
Yeah, I probably said all of that.
All those are right, are not incorrect at least.
Sure.
But at the same time, they really don't address the most fundamental reasons. And if people don't really understand the fundamental reasons, they usually would misinterpret China either over optimistically or over pessimistically.
True.
Or some will say the coming collapse of China, or some will say China is like the 21st century is China's century. I think either extreme is probably not right. Yeah. I think if you really understand the backdrop of China's history, culture, and civilization, then you understand that China actually has the possibility, and I think Haijian heading in that way is to be able to emerge as a very important influencer in the world, with the changes that we're now seeing.
I want to also address another